there's no such thing as right or wrong. All you've got is atoms and electrons bumping up against each other. When you look at all the manuscripts, lots of errors creep in as people copy it century after century after century. How could you possibly know what the true story is? If there was a God, then why would he allow evil and suffering, justice that we experience in life? Yeah. How can you believe in God?
How do you interact? How do you pass on your faith? How do you share the love of Jesus with people who don't agree with what you believe? Join me today as I interview author Justin Brierley on how we can help bring the gospel to those who doubt the existence of God.
I would host debates between atheists and Christians. And so for 17 plus years, I hosted these conversations, bringing some of the brightest atheist, agnostic minds together with some of the best Christian thinkers. And what I discovered is that Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet intellectually, that you don't have to toss your brain in the trash can to be a Christian. And I also learned that there are some really good reasons to believe in God. I'm not going to lie, there were some of those conversations where I honestly felt like, my goodness, how is the Christian going to respond to this one? But I always discovered there was a good response, actually.
What is your greatest argument for God?
Wow. It's not that I have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is a God. All we're really being asked to do is to say...
Justin, it's great to have you on the show, man. I know you're out there in the UK. It's 9 o'clock at night, but thanks for coming on anyway. Appreciate you, brother.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be with you. Looks like a fantastic podcast, and glad to be here.
I think as long as we keep talking about him, he's gonna keep helping us because we need help.
Amen. Awesome. Hey, great stuff. It was really good to hear.
Tell us about yourself. I don't know anything about you. Tell us, besides the book, tell us about yourself.
Well, I was raised in a Christian family, but I guess, I've always had an inquisitive mind. And by the time I got to university, I was encountering a lot of skepticism, a lot of doubt around faith. And really, my faith came alive in my teens. But then it kind of came alive intellectually in my late teens, early 20s. I started to discover Christian thinkers like C.S. Lewis and others. But I was I had a kind of theatrical, creative side to me. And so I ended up going into radio, ended up hosting a conversation show for many, many years, for the best part of 17 years, called Unbelievable with a question mark. And it was a bit different because, it was on a Christian radio station, but we actually invited atheists into the studio, and I would host debates between atheists and Christians. And so for 17 plus years, I hosted these conversations, bringing some of the brightest atheist, agnostic minds together with some of the best Christian thinkers. And it was just a lot of fun, a lot of really intense debates and conversations over those years. But I learned an awful lot in the process. And what I discovered is that Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet intellectually, that you don't have to toss your brain in the trash can to be a Christian. And I also learned that there are some really good reasons to believe in God. And so for me, it was an amazing education, but also a really good opportunity to grow in confidence and to realize that actually, Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet. So it's been an amazing journey, and that's really what's at the core of the book.
I tell you what, I love this book. I love what you've done. I love that you've invited people who are on the opposite faith spectrum of you into conversation. I think we can do this. I was in Wyoming speaking at a men's event last weekend. There was a 25-year-old man there, and I said, hey, I'm just engaged him in conversation. He said, yeah, I'm a science guy. I work for the forestry department, and I've been for the last 2 years going to church just to see if Jesus and science align. So he was not a Christian guy, but he's at a Christian men's event, and I was able to share with him, if they don't align perfectly, they have to align because God is the God of science. So it was just really interesting that knowing that we had this interview today. And this conversation came my way. So, okay, I got to ask, do you ever feel like you walked away from a debate and you got your butt kicked? Did you ever feel like, okay, I wasn't ready for that one?
The good news is I was never really doing the debating myself. I was always the moderator in the middle of the debates. So I was bringing on hopefully a good Christian thinker opposite an atheist thinker. But I'll be honest, there were times when it did feel like the Christian got their butt kicked, and that was just the reality of the way it was. These were not like kind of setups or anything like that. These were honest conversations, and sometimes the atheist got the better of the Christian. So it wasn't kind of like safe for all the family radio in that sense. It was very live. It was like anything could happen when you were on air and you were recording. But actually, most of the time, I felt that there was a good response from the Christians, and very often I felt the Christians really, made a very compelling case against the atheists and so on. What I discovered was that it wasn't just Christians listening, though, because we started podcasting quite early on, and suddenly we had all kinds of atheists and agnostics starting to pick up the show, listening along, and that kind of really made me feel kind of a real sense that I had to represent both sides fairly. I had to kind of be a neutral moderator. I was obviously a Christian, but I felt I had to do both sides fairly. And what happened in the process was we just brought on a whole bunch of non-Christian listeners as well, and who really kind of liked the fact that we were being respectful and we were kind of giving a fair sort of shake for their side. And in the process, of course, a number of them started to take Christianity seriously because they were hearing week after week intelligent, respectful conversations, and they may have come in thinking, oh, Christianity is just a fairy tale, a delusion, but they were soon, even if they didn't come to faith, they kind of soon realized, oh, there's intelligent people who believe this stuff. And so that was really interesting to see some of those atheists and agnostics start to change their mind. And of course, I met plenty who did come to faith, with the show being one of the key reasons for it. And so it's been amazing to see some of that stuff happen because we kind of took a risk and decided to try and have these conversations. And as I say, I mean, my faith got challenged at various points along the way. I mean, I'm not going to lie. There were some of those conversations where I honestly felt like, my goodness, how is the Christian going to respond to this one? But I always discovered there was a good response, actually. And so it's not that my faith, kind of came out completely the same as it was before I went in. It got shaken about and punched up a bit, but it did come out tougher for it. There's that proverb about iron sharpens iron. And I think when you're in the middle of that kind of a tussle, it kind of toughens up your faith, and you kind of have to learn how to defend it and how to make sense of it. So for me, it was an amazing process. And I've heard the same from many other people who listen. And it's interesting in terms of men, probably 90% of the audience is men. And this is in the UK, certainly. Most churches are primarily female. It's usually about 2/3 female to 1/3 men in many churches. But when I put on an apologetics conference, almost entirely men. The listenership, almost entirely men. There's something about this approach to faith that just seems to resonate with men. And so that was one of the most interesting things about it. It was such a draw for men, both Christians and atheists. And in that sense, it had this huge evangelistic potential too.
Well, it's funny. When we go to church, my wife loves the worship, and I love the worship too. But man, I'll tell you what, if I don't have good teaching, I can't handle it. She can handle poor teaching, but she can't handle bad worship. And so I think for us men, we're a lot more intellectually driven, cognitive, truth driven. And so what you're saying makes perfect sense to me. So, I got to ask this quiz. I'm so curious. I just love like fishing for men. I love sharing my faith. I love throwing a lure and seeing what lure bites. And, you know what I mean? And so my question is, what are some questions that doubters, agnostics, atheists, whatever, what are some questions that they threw out over the past years? You said 17 years. What questions tended to rattle Christians? What were some questions that rattled you, that got you to go, I don't know?
Well, I remember distinctly one particular show where I was bringing on probably one of the most preeminent critical scholars of the New Testament, someone who had been a Christian but had lost their faith and had become a very vocal critic of the Bible and whether we could trust it. And this is a New Testament scholar called Bart Ehrman, and he's very well known in his field. And he had just published a best-selling book that had sold hundreds of thousands of copies just at a popular level. And it was a book that was really calling into question whether you could trust the New Testament documents, whether we had been given the tradition around Jesus, whether it had been handed on in a historically safe way. And he was casting all kinds of doubt on whether the manuscripts, whether they had been copied accurately and all the mistakes that come in over time and that kind of thing. So when I read this book, I thought, my goodness, this guy, this guy has a point here. And I, at this point, I hadn't really read any counter arguments. So I was just thinking, gosh, what are we going to do? And well, the person I brought on opposite him in the end was a New Testament scholar called Peter J. Williams. Peter J. Williams, by the way, has recently published a brilliant book called "Can We Trust the Gospels?" and it's just my go-to resource now for this kind of thing. But what I realized was when Peter came on to have the conversation with Bart Ehrman, I'd only read one side of this, Bart Ehrman's take on this. When I brought Peter J. Williams, an incredibly good Cambridge scholar, a devout Christian, he just made me realize there's always two sides to every story, and someone can kind of spin the facts sort of in a way that makes everything look terrible. And then you hear from someone else, same scholar, access to all the same material, but he suddenly puts a different light on it. And he makes you realize, as he put it, I think the glass is half full rather than half empty here. And what he made me realize is basically, actually, when it comes to the New Testament, okay, we have one of the most incredible sets of historical documents.
More than any other work.
That outpass any other text of ancient history by a country mile. When it comes to how early these gospels were written down, after Jesus's life, how early the actual manuscripts are that we have that exist, the number of manuscripts, and this is the key thing. So this was what Bart Ehrman had done in his book. One of his key claims in his book was, when you look at all the manuscripts, there are so many differences between them. Kind of how could you possibly know what the true story is? Because over time, lots of errors creep in as people copy it century after century after century. But what Peter J. Williams pointed out is, well, that quote unquote problem is also the solution to your problem, because it's because we have so many manuscripts and we can do the science of comparing them with modern technology. We can actually recover with like 99.9% accuracy the original words, even though we don't have those original, documents, the papyrus, because obviously they've crumbled and faded away. It turns out that because we've got so many, we can do this comparing and contrasting, and it's kind of like a kind of detective. And you put it together, and it means we've actually managed to bring together these incredibly good quality, accounts of what was first written down. And so when it turned out, when you actually got down to it with Bart Ehrman in this debate, there were actually only about 5 or 6 places where he actually thought there was uncertainty about what was originally written down. Literally only 5 or 6 places in the whole of the Gospels. And even on those ones, he had an opinion on what it actually was. So it turned out this kind of whole book that was, gave me a sleepless night or two. It turned out to be completely the opposite. So that's just one of those examples where, you can get one point of view and you can get really riled but then you realize, it's about making sure you've understood both sides of the argument. And for me, that was one of those classic cases.
Man. Well, that's for me. I believe the Bible is the infallible, not the inerrant word. So it's infallible. So everything that's supposed to be there is there, even though maybe somebody transliterated it wrong in a manuscript. You know what I mean? It's all there. Everything we need. But so refresh my memory. So number 2 on the original manuscripts list is Homer's Iliad, correct?
Yeah. So those kinds of documents tend to be the ones that scholars will go to, the Gallic Wars, things like that. And the interesting thing is, though, when you do go to those kind of, documents of the same kind of period of ancient history, you might be dealing with 3 or 4 copies in existence. Yes. And the earliest version of the copy we have might be hundreds of years after. And yet no one questions the events that these talk about. So, the crossing of the Rubicon by Caesar, is only attested to in essentially one document. But no one questions that as a just. So whenever I've encountered the so-called Jesus mythicist folk online who kind of say, "Oh, we just don't know whether Jesus existed," I want to say to them, if you don't believe that Jesus existed, you might as well stop believing in
Jesus is easy.
Any figure of history.
Jesus is easy.
Yeah.
I mean, so how? Okay,
exactly.
Help me out. I know I'm going to screw this up, but original New Testament manuscripts, is it like 1,000 or is it 10,000? What is it? We have thousands.
Yeah,
right?
well, easily more than that, thousands and thousands. Well, it depends. So obviously, the further back you go, the more rare you are, and so. But they're always discovering, interestingly, new fragments. So it's extraordinary what you can still turn up. But we have kind of some of the earliest manuscripts we have of parts of the Gospels and so on come from the second century. There are some which have kind of maybe just edged into the first century as well. But basically, the interesting thing about it is not just how early those fragments are and how many of them we have. And so we can kind of piece together our first full Gospels within 150 years or so of the events. But it's also the telltale signs within those manuscripts and the words that kind of place them so close to the events themselves. These weren't, if you like, being written down a long time after the events. And we can tell that from, for instance, Paul's letters. Obviously we have evidence for Jesus from the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Paul's letters were written even earlier than those. And so we actually have a lot of evidence about the early church and Jesus just from what Paul wrote. And that was within, in many cases, 10 years of when Jesus was doing his ministry. And he's often quoting, interestingly, traditions that are even closer to that. So 1 Corinthians 15 is a good example of this, where, again, one of the sort of objections that's sometimes leveled at Christian faith is, well, the resurrection of Jesus, maybe that it was just something that developed over time, a kind of legendary thing that over a generation or two, came about by word of mouth. But that you can't argue that when you actually look at Paul's 1 Corinthians 15, because Paul's writing there only within about 10 to 15 years of the events.
Yeah.
Firstly.
Yeah, the mid-50s.
Yeah, exactly. And then he's actually quoting, you can tell from the way he's writing that he's quoting a tradition that's been passed on to him. He literally says that this was the tradition that was passed on to me. And it's a kind of creedal form. And so scholars reckon that actually what he's actually quoting is something that Christians were already circulating and, singing in their assemblies within a few years of Jesus's death and resurrection. So this is like gold dust for historians.
Yeah.
You would never get anything that's that close to the events in any other part of ancient literature. And yet we have it in Paul's letters, these accounts that are so close to the original events. So for me, that's just one example of the way in which the Bible does stand head and shoulders above other ancient literature.
You talk about C.S. Lewis, his book, Mere Christianity and Liar, Lunatic, or Lord, the trilemma. To me, Jesus is a slam dunk. To me, to not believe he was a real human, historically, that's just insanity on some level. But what I like about your approach, I want to go back a little further. I love the approach in the book. You talk about, you say, and we live in a world that if I don't agree with you or I have a doubt, you're the enemy. And I think that is a wrong approach. And you said in your book, quote, rather than seeing doubt as the enemy of faith, I see it as an inevitable part of the process of making sense of our beliefs. So when we look at it that way and we see a person of doubt or whatever it may be, maybe they've been wounded, maybe they blame God, instead of seeing them as the enemy, we have a great opportunity. How should we approach that person?
Well, I think if it's you experiencing doubt or if it's someone who's experiencing doubt, as I said, I think you just have to recognize that is a normal part of the Christian journey. Everyone experiences doubt. You don't have to be religious to experience doubt. There are all kinds of things we can experience doubt about. And Jesus, even the people who knew and walked with Jesus, they experienced doubt. There's that famous line when the man whose daughter needs to be healed, or son says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. It's part of the human condition where people, we're a mixture of both. And it's not that Christianity is ultimately about becoming certain of our beliefs. I don't think certainty is ever something we achieve in that sense, because faith in a way is about trusting in God without necessarily knowing everything, without having absolute certainty at our fingertips. But it's about trusting the God we do know for the things that we don't know. And so for me, that is part of the journey of becoming a Christian, of becoming someone who is trusting in God, is actually learning to live with a certain amount of doubt, with a certain amount of, unanswered questions and that kind of thing. What I would say is that doubt needn't be the enemy of faith in that sense, because actually doubt is often the thing that drives us very often to look for answers and to seek ways in which we can learn and strengthen our faith in all kinds of ways. So for me, I've had plenty of moments of doubt, but they've always been a catalyst for me to go and look for answers and to not sort of simply stay there in the midst of kind of suffocating doubt. I think that there are, some kinds of doubt that can be quite damaging, because if you kind of live constantly on the edge of sort of, I can't trust this or I can't trust that, there's a sense in which we're given enough, I think, in scripture and through the revelation around us and through personal experience to know that we can trust God, that we can take that step of faith. But you still have to take the step, and you have to be willing to, if you like, entrust yourself to God. So there's a point at which you just have to accept, I'm never going to know everything. And I'm just going to have to do what ultimately this whole thing is about. Trust in the God who has been revealed to me for the things that I don't know. And it's only when we do actively step out and take a step of faith that we're really putting our skin in the game. That's when it really matters, if you know.
No,
what I mean.
I do know what you mean. I love what you said. You said it 3 different times in 3 different ways, but it was trusting the God we do know with the things we do not know. It's really interesting. There's an author over here in Oregon named Randy Alcorn. He wrote a book called Heaven. And he talks about earth as a running head start into heaven. Of course, Maximus said in Gladiator, everything on earth echoes in heaven, of course, famous line. But what hits me is that in Alcorn's book, he talks about even in heaven, we don't know everything. It's an unfolding eternity in heaven of knowing. And so if that's the case, it makes sense on earth that we will have curiosities and doubts. So for me, let me just tell you my journey. I wrote a poem at age probably 20, very short poem, trying to articulate who God was as the only uncreated being. To me, Justin, that was the faith place. Jesus was easy. To me, to believe and acknowledge that in the beginning something existed that was not where nothing existed, that was very hard for me to overcome. But I just said by faith, I just received it. So here's the question for you. And I've read, C.S. Lewis actually has an answer for this. So I'm wondering what your answer is. Is it possible to go back before creation and prove the existence of God? I mean, what is your greatest argument for God?
Wow. Well, I actually begin the book with 3 key arguments for God. And this was one of the big revelations for me, honestly, when I started hosting these conversations. I realized it's not that I, as a Christian, have to do all the hard work of proving to my atheist friend that God exists. In fact, the atheist friend also has some burden of evidence to shoulder, because pretty much all the atheists who came on my show, they had a set of beliefs, whether they called it that or not. And it was basically something like what you might call materialism or naturalism. It was the view that all that exists is the laws of nature, the material stuff of the universe, atoms, electrons, protons, whatever. And that's it. And everything else comes out of that, And the problem is that, that's interesting. That's a really interesting metaphysical view of the world, but it's got all kinds of consequences. It means there's no overarching story to life or the universe. We kind of came from nowhere. We're heading nowhere. It throws up all kinds of questions about truth and justice and love and all those sorts of things, if really it's all down to a bunch of chemistry. So I realized that what we're actually dealing with here is 2 different ways of looking at the world. This atheist naturalism and Christianity, the view that there's a God behind it. And it's not that I have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is a God. All we're really being asked to do is to say which of these 2 options makes best sense of the evidence that's available to all of us. Okay. And I think that's a more modest thing to do. And actually, it makes it perfectly reasonable, in my view, that there's a God, because it turns out there's a whole lot of stuff that this atheist materialist view just cannot account for. So, for instance, I begin by talking about human existence. I think God makes sense of human existence, makes much better sense of human existence than atheism does. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. There are things that modern science is showing us. The fine-tuning of the universe for life, for instance, is this extraordinary phenomenon that is now the absolute consensus among physicists and cosmologists, that basically the universe, when it came into being, was birthed with a set of fundamental numbers and laws that were so perfectly dialed. So things like the force of gravity and the force of electromagnetism, that if they had differed from their actual value by a tiny, tiny fraction, like we're talking 1 part in 10 to the 60, that's a 1 with 60 zeros after it. If it had differed by that tiny, tiny fraction, life would not exist in the universe. No life. It's kind of, it is pretty mind-boggling, some of these numbers. I mean, some of them are far, far, far more finely tuned than that as well. But what it tells you is it doesn't look like life is just a cosmic accident, okay? It looks like this was set up.
Yes.
There's a mind behind the universe. The universe, and what's more than that, the universe itself cannot explain itself because it had to come from somewhere. All material things need an explanation for their existence. It's just the way it is. Nothing just pops into existence without any explanation. And what we know, again, from our best science, is that the universe popped into existence. We call it the Big Bang. It happened 14 billion years ago. All of time, space, and matter suddenly came into existence. There was a moment in time when the universe was smaller than the head of a pin. Literally everything in this universe was contained in something that was smaller than the head of a pin. That is pretty mind-boggling. Yeah. And you've got to ask yourself, where does that come from? And for me, the only answer you can really turn to is something that transcends time and space and matter, because that's the thing it's explaining. And the only answer that's ever been given to that question is God. Yeah. Okay. So there's all these things that for me, human existence, the fact we have a universe, the fact we are able to exist in the universe, that naturally point to God, and they just don't work as well with this atheist view. It doesn't seem to make sense of them. So that's one. Human value. I'll quickly run through two more. Human existence, human value. The fact we believe that every human being has intrinsic worth and value and dignity, and we enshrine this in documents of human rights. Again, this idea of the equal value of all human beings is not something that comes out of atheism. It's like science and reason, they're not going to tell you those kinds of things. That's not what they're there for. But there is an account of the world which makes perfect sense of our belief that all humans have equal value. And it's because on page 1 of the Bible, it says, when God created humans, he created them in his image, male and female, he created them. If we're all made in God's image, then of course we all have equal value. It makes perfect sense of this deep-seated belief that humans have this kind of value. Yes. If we're just the end product of a purposeless process, there's no reason we should believe that humans have any special regard or should treat each other in any particular way. Yep. And then finally, human purpose, the why question. Across every single time, space and culture, everyone has looked for some kind of transcendent meaning to life. And the problem is, again, on the atheist worldview, there is no such story about a transcendent meaning. When your time's up and you're gone, it's lights out. And one day it'll be lights out for everything, because the universe is going to run out of usable energy in a few trillion years' time. And all that will be left is a cold, sterile void with no memory of anything that ever happened. And most people don't feel like that's a satisfactory story of reality. Okay, is that it? Was that what the whole point was? I think most people naturally feel like there's a better story than that. And it's a story in which there is a purpose and there is an ultimate meaning to life. And at the center of that story is a person called Jesus Christ, who holds that out to us with both hands. So for me, these are some of the things that point towards God and away from atheism.
Okay, so C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity talked about this argument as well. And maybe there are holes in this argument. You've heard them all, so tell me what you think, because this is kind of my argument. The very fact that an atheist does not believe in God, doesn't that statement refute their own belief? Like, how can you say you don't believe in something but name it in your statement of unbelief? Isn't that a statement of faith? I don't believe in God. Isn't that a statement of faith? C.S. Lewis said that the very fact that we think about God and consider God, and this might come back to your human value argument, the very fact that we even consider God is essentially an argument for God. Am I onto something here?
Here's the way I would put it, and I think you are onto something there. One of the ways Lewis put this was, for those who say there is no God, one of the reasons they often give for claiming there is no God is that we live in such an unjust universe. If there was a God, then why would he allow, evil and suffering and that kind of thing, and the injustice that we
hear that one
experience
a lot
in life? Yeah. But this was the thing that Lewis was himself an atheist, in his early years, into his, until he was sort of converted in his early 30s. And one of the things that led to his conversion was that he realized that argument against God doesn't make sense, because you have to assume that there is some kind of a moral order in the universe. To be able to say this is unjust means that there must be some kind of moral standard to which you're appealing. As he put it in the book, a man cannot call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is.
That is so good.
And so what he was saying was, by appealing to this kind of reason you shouldn't believe in God, you're actually saying, no, God does exist.
Yes.
Because there has to be something beyond you, beyond nature, to which you're appealing for this idea of there being goodness and truth and justice. Those things don't exist in a world without God. It is just, a free for all. There's no such thing as right or wrong or anything. All you've got is atoms and electrons bumping up against each other. There's no
drink and
such
be
thing
merry.
as truth, whatever. So he was saying, look, if you believe in justice and you're saying God doesn't exist because I've seen this injustice, well, you're kind of refuting yourself, because you're already having to assume that there is a God in order to
that's kind of my thought.
Disprove God.
Yeah. Oh, that's
So that was his insight. And to be honest, that works on lots of different things. I have atheist friends who subscribe to something called determinism.
Yeah.
Now, determinism is the view that everything that happens has basically already been decided by a causal series of events. Okay, so effectively, and they think they're very clever for saying this, because they say everything you believe and think, Justin, has been completely determined. You had no free will whatsoever. It's just the way the universe works out, and that's why it's determined what you chose for breakfast. It's determined what you didn't have any freedom to choose in all of this. And so they say, and so how can you believe in God? Because there's not even any free will. And I'm like, well, hang on. The problem with that view is that it radically undercuts your own worldview.
Yes.
Because if there is no freedom, then how did you come to your belief that there is no God? You didn't come to it through freely choosing to weigh up the evidence and using logic and that kind of thing. It was just the outworking, the meaningless outworking of a set of atoms and a process that happened over billions of years. And what ended up was your brain fizzing in such a way that you're an atheist, and my brain fizzing in such a way that I'm a Christian. There's no truth in the matter. It's just physics. It's just chemistry in the end. And so the problem is, if you're a determinist and you say there's no such thing as free will because it's all just material stuff happening, the problem is you have no reason to believe anything that you're saying, because it completely undercuts the very argument you're making. You can't even believe in determinism if you're a determinist, because the very thoughts that you're having are themselves not rational. They're just the outworking of physical processes. And so this is another thing that C.S. Lewis pointed out. He said the very idea of reason itself gets completely undermined by this atheist worldview. So it's this is kind of getting to the deeper philosophical kind of depths of these kinds of arguments, but there's all kinds of ways in which atheism itself, when you really take it to its logical conclusions, kind of starts to actually undermine itself in all kinds of fascinating ways.
Yeah, when I think of determinism, what I think of is, okay, well, something's determining this. And even if you're saying it's a physical or a chemical reaction, there's something behind it that's ultimately leading down that path. I mean, you got to put a name on that. So really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. and that there is that whole question of, where even if you do believe in, we're just the end product of a set of causal events, you have to have something, as you say, that begins the whole process. It's kind of, it can't stretch out forever. You have to have something that began this whole thing. And we know that the universe wasn't what began it. The universe at some point began. So lots of things seem to point back towards the idea that there is, what the philosophers call a first mover, a first
Well,
call.
I just even go back to Darwin, admitting that the human eye being a part of natural selection is preposterous. The human eye couldn't have evolved. So he undermined his own argument in natural selection with the human eye. It all unwinds eventually.
Yeah, and the thing is that so often, sadly, science, as you were saying earlier, has been used as a kind of battering ram against God by these new atheist characters. A lot of the people I was engaging and answering, especially in the early years of the show, were these very well-known atheists like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, the so-called new atheists. They all had their own best-selling anti-God books, and a number of them were scientists like Richard Dawkins, and so they were pulling out evolution as supposedly some kind of case closed against God. But nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, the reality is, first of all, at one level, you simply don't get a process of evolution in the first place without having something to work on, i.e. the origin of life. And the origin of life has never been solved on a materialistic basis. It's the complexity of the chemical code in the first DNA molecule is impossible to explain on a purely material basis. That you do not get that kind of complexity, that kind of language without design being involved. And so a lot of people assume, evolution has just sort of solved how humans came about. It has done no such thing. The very best it can do is get to work on something that already existed. But then you've got the fact that evolution itself is a theory in crisis in many ways, because there has just been so much work done by extremely reputable mainstream scientists to show that it cannot account basically for the diversity of life on Earth. Certainly not the version of evolution that a lot of those new atheists were kind of holding up. And I've been really struck by people like Stephen Meyer, who runs the Center for the Discovery Institute in Seattle, who's just done such a good job with books like The God Hypothesis, showing all the different ways in which God is actually being affirmed by science rather than discredited, both from things I've mentioned, the fine-tuning of the universe, what it took for there to be life in the universe, but also just this extraordinary way in which the development of life simply cannot be the result of purely natural causes. It's got design written all over it in so many ways.
I agree. Well, you talk about, so here's what I want to kind of address. I want to address this deconstruction concept. So now I'm out here in America. I'm a big fan of education. I'm not so sure I'm a fan of academia lately because of deconstruction, because I'm seeing a lot of these students go away to Christian schools having their faith deconstructed, but they're not attaching anything on the other end of it except for a godless worldview. I don't know if that's nefarious. I don't know what it is, but how would you describe deconstruction in your book, and how can we use that to actually grow in our faith?
Great question. Well, I remember there being a period of a few years, about 5 years ago, when it just seemed like every other week there was some worship pastor or former pastor coming out on social media saying, I no longer believe, or I've kind of become, a very different progressive Christian or something. And this kind of came to be termed deconstruction. And in short, deconstruction is kind of people who perhaps had a faith of some kind, but essentially have begun to pull it apart, to deconstruct it, and are perhaps turning to a very different form of faith, or to no faith at all. I suppose the fact is that has always existed. There have always been people who have deconverted, who have lost their faith. It's just, I think social media and the internet kind of has given a new platform for many of them to kind of talk about that and so on. And there was just this wave of these sorts of stories over a period. One of the ones that really caught my attention was John Steingard, who was a former singer with a Christian band called Hawk Nelson. And he kind of, during the kind of COVID lockdown, came out with a sort of a set of Instagram posts saying how he was deconstructing his faith and losing his faith and so on. Well, actually, I ended up getting in touch with John, and he came on my show to have a conversation about this. And John is actually a really lovely guy, very thoughtful, deep thinker. And so I ended up bringing him to conversation with Sean McDowell.
Oh yeah,
who's
I know he's on our
great.
show.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Sean's great, really wonderful Christian thinker, really great communicator, and they just had a great conversation actually. And in which John, was very open about the struggles he'd had, and essentially, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he might be willing to say he'd led, in a sense, a relatively sheltered life in terms of he'd never really given himself the space, I think, to think about some of the deep questions. And he'd been kind of so busy on the road and touring and everything, he'd kind of stuffed those questions, those intellectual questions down. And it was only when suddenly there was kind of an enforced break from that COVID brought, that he sort of allowed those questions suddenly to, and he suddenly found he didn't feel like he had good answers to them. So he ended up sort of, writing this kind of essay length stuff on his social media feed. But Sean very helpfully, I think, pointed out that a lot of the things John was concerned about were kind of issues that in the end aren't necessarily core to Christian faith. Yeah, you can have your concerns about how do you make sense of hell and that kind of thing. But in the end, as I said earlier, there's lots of things that we're gonna find mysterious or whatever in this life. We're not going to have the answers to everything. But in the end, the question is, was Jesus who he said he was? Did he die? And did he come back to life? If that's true, if there's good evidence for that, then you can kind of work the rest out,
Yes.
Around that. And that was really helpful because Sean was just able to pinpoint that actually a lot of the issues, John also talked about the problem of suffering and evil and those kinds of things. And Sean just very helpfully, I think, managed to show that there are answers to these things. Yeah, we're always going to, as we said earlier, struggle with doubt at some level. But simply turning to atheism, well, that doesn't solve these issues either. You're still going to have the problem of evil and suffering. It's just you're going to have a meaningless problem rather than a mystery to deal with on an atheist worldview. But it was done in such a gentle and pastoral way. That was the key. And I think sometimes that there is always that danger of kind of just going in a kind of knee-jerk way when we hear these stories, and they maybe, even give us pause for thought. And we can have a kind of almost reaction of fear sometimes as Christians to hear of people who are questioning their faith and that kind of thing. And I don't think that's helpful. I think it's important to hear people's journeys, to kind of try and get alongside them, but also to pastorally engage them. And what I loved about this conversation that John and Sean ended up having is that it turned out they lived not far from each other.
I was going to say they're both SoCal guys.
Yeah. So they ended up getting together and they started going on runs together. And Sean just kind of kept up the friendship with John. And so they ended up, John ended up going on Sean's show and they continued to have some conversations. Well, in the end, I don't know exactly where John Steingard is now, but actually they had some really constructive conversations. And I think actually a lot of the people listening in a funny way, were able to realize actually there are good reasons for faith. And, wherever John finds himself, actually, I think Sean did an amazing job of showing that, yes, faith gets shaken sometimes, but it's a mistake to simply leave your faith deconstructed on the floor. If that's where you end up, all you've done is kind of take something apart, but you haven't really built something in its place, honestly.
Correct.
And for me, I've met enough Christians who have gone through that deconstruction process, but have come out the other side and have actually put the pieces back together. And what they end up with is something stronger and more durable than what they had before. To know that does happen, that you don't have to stay in that deconstructed phase. There are answers. You may have to do some really hard thinking. You may have to put aside some of the ideas you grew up with. A lot of the time I find that the deconstruction stories, they essentially circle around some kind of issue that was a very particular doctrine that was pressed upon them in their childhood, but it's not central to Christianity. And when you put all your weight on that thing, and then it turns out, there are other ways of looking at it, that's a really sad reason for someone to lose their faith, because all you need to do is just take a bit of a broader look at Christianity and realize this is not something that that we need to lose our faith over. So for me, I'm just trying in that chapter on deconstruction to encourage people. There are some ways in which we tend to create a more brittle kind of faith for ourselves that can easily be deconstructed because it wasn't built on good ground to begin with. But when we pick up the pieces, start to look at the foundations, and then put it back together again, we can actually build something much more durable. And I finished the chapter by talking about a guy called Jim, who I know, who was a Christian, became an atheist for many years, and only in the last few years suddenly found his way back to faith because he found that there were answers to what he was looking for. And he's just a good example of the fact that construction happens as well as deconstruction.
Absolutely.
And I want to kind of encourage people.
Yeah, if you're a guy listening right now and your faith has been deconstructed, listen, I want to encourage you to seek truth and begin building. I believe if you believe in the truth, you're going to come back to Jesus. But so Justin, that's my next question. You've got a guy or a gal who says, okay, I'm believe in God. Okay, I believe in God, so I'm just struggling with this Jesus thing. So how do you bridge, forgive the pun here, how do you bridge the gap between God and Jesus in conversation with somebody who's wrestling with Jesus and Christianity, or just trying to understand that concept?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I would want to tell someone in that position is just go and read the Gospels. Just see what happens when you go and read the Gospels with an open mind, and maybe just ask yourself, why have generations and generations and millions of people and whole cultures and nations been transformed by this person and the words he spoke in these accounts? Because there's something there.
Yes.
Even if you're very skeptical.
Yes.
There's something happened. Okay, there's something there, and then I would want to say, I've often been asked this question. Well, look, okay, maybe God exists, Justin, but which God? There are so many religions.
My next
out
question.
There. So many kind of ways. How can you possibly choose between them? Wouldn't you have to kind of exhaustively work out every single religious viewpoint before saying Jesus is the way that God has shown up? And I don't think that's true. And the one of the analogies I use for this is that, when I go to unlock the door of our church, I have a key ring that has a lot of similar looking keys on it. And sometimes I try a couple of keys in the door before I find the one that actually opens the door and I can go in. But when I've found the key that opens the door, I don't then try every other key just in case that one also opens the door. I know I found the one key that opens it. And I think it's like that with Jesus. I don't think you have to exhaustively search every religion. If you find good evidence that Jesus is who he said he was, the Son of God, and that he died and he rose in vindication of that claim, then you found the key. You found the key. You found the person who actually is the revelation and manifestation of God in human flesh. And so you don't have to, it's good to be aware and educated about other religions, but you don't have to search them all out exhaustively. You found, if Jesus is who he said he was and he died and rose in vindication of that claim, you found the answer. And for me, this is the extraordinary thing about Christianity. It has this extraordinarily strong historical record about this person, Jesus, about who he was, about his death. Again, that is one of the best attested facts in ancient history. And his resurrection. This is not just a kind of, oh, wouldn't it be nice if it were true kind of story. It's a story that makes sense historically for all kinds of reasons. There's no reason why a bunch of first century Jewish people would have made this up.
Correct.
It would have gone against all of their theological expectations, against all of their comfort and their, their way of life. And yet this was the thing they started saying, that this person who'd suffered this criminal's death, the most shameful death you can imagine, had been raised to life. And they were so confident about that, they went out and changed the world on the back of it. And so for me, it's like, I would want to say to someone, look at that, have a really good look at that. Just stop and think about that. Because something happened, okay? Something happened in the first century that has completely transformed the world ever since. So it's worth giving some of your time and attention to and asking, could this be the key that unlocks the door?
Well, here's the other thing. 11 out of 12 died for it.
Mm.
I mean, not only did they spread the gospel, but they were so convinced they died for it. And I think you can say the same about Jesus, okay? And this is a C.S. Lewis argument, right? Like Jesus had this message, and if he gave this message and he didn't know he was lying to the world, that would make him insane. And if he gave this message and knew he was lying, that would make him a demon, lunatic, liar. Yeah. But if he gave this message and it really is true, then he really is Lord. So you only have those three options, that trilemma, liar, lunatic, or Lord. And he died for what he believed. So it's like, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And again, I think a lot of people don't realize how extraordinary this evidence for the resurrection is, you know, because, I mean, just one little fact that I just find quite extraordinary is, isn't it extraordinary that all four Gospels record women as the first discoverers of the empty tomb? And the reason that's so important for us now is because that is something you would never make up.
Correct.
As if your aim was to try and fool first century Jewish people.
That would have hurt the movement.
Because it should
have hurt the movement.
That would have been the last thing you should have done, because a woman's testimony was worth far less than a man's in that particular culture. And yet, in every single gospel, it is women who are the first discoverers of the empty tomb. And now, by what is called the criterion of embarrassment in historical terms, this counts as an incredible confirmation that this is a story we can believe. The story of the empty tomb makes sense because you wouldn't have made something like that up. And so it kind of has this reverse sort of psychology effect now, where historians say this is actually really good evidence that a group of female followers discovered his empty tomb, because they'd have no motivation for making up that story. And when you don't have any motivation for making up a story and it's there in a historical record, it's very likely it's true.
Yeah.
So all of these things kind of come together to kind of reinforce. There's all kinds of strands of evidence with the resurrection that all together make up a whole where the most obvious thing to say is maybe they were telling the truth. Maybe this guy came back to life. And in my experience, when people kind of get that and then act on it, it does change the world. And that's the thing. It's like, I wouldn't want anyone to sort of stop there at just a kind of intellectual assent to something. It's you know, if it's true, then everything is changed. You know, if it's true that God came as a human being and he rose again, that completely flips the script on everything. And it gives us a task to go out and do something about it. And that for me is when the fun really begins.
Well, and you talk about the women at the tomb, but, you know, for me, it's really funny. You know, in Mark 16, verse 7, the women come back, but the angel says, go and tell the disciples and Peter. That two-word phrase, you know, Mark is written through the eyes of Peter, right? And so the funny part to me about one of the reasons for me to believe in the Bible is there's no other religious work ever written where the Bible highlights, almost brags about the failures of its main characters. I mean, Peter's telling Mark, you put that in there. You put that in there. I denied him. So really, so I have a question for you at the end here. So we're talking about why I'm still a Christian. I love the cover right here. But I was at the chiropractor last week, and on the news, I saw something really encouraging. So we're talking about all of this evidence, Justin, but at the end of the day, we have a living Savior who indwells us with his Holy Spirit and changes us and takes something that we can't explain scientifically, objectively, and makes it a subjective, personal reality. I was watching the news, and I saw that in the UK, Gen Z males are coming to Christ at an insanely rapid rate, even more so than that of the women. You said earlier that 90% of your listeners are men. So can you talk to us about what's going on in the UK right now? Is there a revival? What's going on over there?
Well, this is very much the subject of a book I wrote before the one we've been talking about, a book called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Love it. And there has been some extraordinary things happening here in the UK. So just very briefly, in summary, that Surprising Rebirth book is all about the way I saw these conversations on faith changing during the time I was hosting the Unbelievable show, and this very atheistic way of looking at things in the culture gave way to a very different conversation as you saw secular intellectuals like Jordan Peterson coming on the scene.
Yeah.
Suddenly, this non-Christian who was directing thousands of young men towards Christianity in his lectures and his talks and things. So I just noticed a real change in the atmosphere. People were willing to talk about God in very different terms. There was a new openness to the value of faith. But that's been met, interestingly, not just by these interesting intellectuals, but by a groundswell of people, especially young men, who are suddenly looking for a better story about life.
Better story.
And so we just had about a month and a half ago at the time of recording, an extraordinary piece of research published here in the UK called The Quiet Revival, published by the Bible Society. And they did a survey back in 2018, a very thorough, credible survey, many thousands in the sample size. And it wasn't particularly encouraging reading. It showed 4% and less than that when it came to young men, of young people attending church at least once a month. And generally, the statistics were confirmed that the general decline of church going and Christianity in the West and in the UK in particular. Then they did the same survey, exactly the same survey last year, and they were shocked. In 6 years, there had been an incredible upturn in church going across the board, an increase of about 50% overall in terms of church going. But the most extraordinary thing was among the young people. From an average of about 4% in 2018, it had shot up to about 16% of young people going to church. So like a fourfold increase. But among young men, even more. They were below 4%, and they'd gone up to 21%, a fivefold increase. Now, this was kind of really surprising to everyone. But to me, actually, it wasn't as surprising as all that, because I had been hearing so many stories in the last 2 years of young guys just turning up at church. They'd bought a Bible, they'd been listening to Jordan Peterson, and they were just turning up in the doors of churches and saying, we want to know more about Christianity. We don't want to know more about faith. And there has just been story after story after story that we're hearing here in the UK. I was at a meeting with sort of about 20 or 30 church leaders from different church networks around the UK a few weeks ago. And just around the table, everyone was sharing something's happening in our churches. We're seeing all these people turn up. We're seeing numbers of baptisms going up, the numbers of people converting. Easter, just an extraordinary number of stories of churches absolutely packed out. And this is happening not just here in the UK, in France, in Norway, in Finland. All of them are reporting the same thing, and it's especially among the young men.
Yeah.
So what's going on? And I also run a podcast that's named after this book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. I just recently did a 2-part feature on why young men are returning to church. And at the bottom of it is basically there's been a male identity crisis brewing in the West for several generations. Men who just don't know who they are or what they're here for. They've kind of, they feel let down by the culture. They feel condescended to because they've been told that masculinity is toxic, and that, and all of the norms of culture have been shaken and everything's in flux. And that produces massive amounts of instability and a lostness, especially among young men. And now, as we know, there are some sadly negative directions in which people go when they're looking for purpose and meaning and identity. There are the Andrew Tates of this world who want to kind of put on some kind of, macho, misogynistic kind of version.
He is not our ally.
But, no, absolutely. But a good number of them are bumping into characters like Jordan Peterson. These kind of figures who kind of almost provide a father-like figure and just say often very commonsensical things, but it kind of suddenly wakes these young men up to the idea there is more to life. I need to go looking for purpose. I can't tell you how many young men I've met who have said, I started going to church because of Jordan Peterson. Now, wherever, I don't know where Jordan Peterson is, on his journey.
I don't think anybody does. But I
interviewed him.
He definitely
once,
is not hurting the Christians, that's for sure.
Exactly. But I have just seen so many of these young men who are now going on this journey, and the reason they're coming back to church is because it offers them a kind of stability, a structure to their life that they're lacking otherwise. And interestingly, it's the kind of it's the more traditional forms of church that are often drawing them, because they want something that's quite demanding. Actually, they don't want to kind of be let off the hook and sort of you just do what you want. They want something that will kind of, take something and they have to give something to. So I've just been stunned to see suddenly the floodgates opening and all these young guys looking for a better story of life, and suddenly they're returning to the Christian story, and I'm just in awe of it. I'm very thankful to God for it, and I just pray that Christians and churches are ready for the fact that young men are turning back to God again.
Yeah, it's coming. It's happening in America. I'm super excited. Man, what a great conversation, Justin. Super excited about you. Where can guys, where do you want to send them to get a copy of Why I'm Still a Christian?
Well, if you want signed copies, they're available from my website, justinbrierley.com. But you can just get your copy wherever you get your books online as well. But yeah, if you want to check out more of my stuff, this book, my other book, the podcast I've mentioned, justinbrierley.com is a good place to go.
I'm excited about getting this live. And man, thank you so much for coming on the show. What a great episode, equipping these men to become their best version in Christ, knowing what they believe and why. Thank you so much.
God bless you guys. Thanks for having me on.
If you're a regular listener and you have not yet subscribed, make sure you're following us on your podcast app. A lot of people just listen without following, but the new follows really help us climb the charts. So this is the one time for you to give back by hitting follow, or on YouTube, hitting subscribe. Until next time, feel the wet sand on the arena floor, hear the deafening roar of the crowd, taste the sweetness of victory, smell the stench of battle, get in the game, get dirty, grind it out, know what you believe and why, and be a man.